Thank you, Mansour. Good morning, everybody. It's terrific to see you all out here. I missed most of yesterday, the dynamic day. I did make it to the cocktail party. That was the most important part of the symposium. One thing about the cocktail party is that it's a good place to get feedback on the day. The feedback that you get at a cocktail party is mostly positive, for obvious reasons. But it sounded like a great day. I was actually watching the app feed and also the Twitter feed, and I understand we were trending across Canada yesterday, number 3. Well done, the communications team. But you know, it's been really fun for me as the global CEO of ULI to watch the progress that's being made up here in Toronto and really across Canada. You've had the benefit of a really vibrant, dynamic, interesting, complicated market. You've got great leadership with Rob as chair now, Mark Noskowitz before him, a great staff led by Richard Joy, and you know, you're all here. So Toronto has a little bit higher proportion of public sector members as a percentage of the total membership than the organization as a whole. I think that's a good thing. And something we're committed to replicating globally, we hope. That sort of public-private balance is very important to ULI's dynamism as an organization. But it's especially, you know, as Mansour said, I'm really committed to the global growth of ULI, so it's very exciting to see this happening outside the US. As a matter of fact, Toronto and ULI Australia are kind of the two most vibrant hubs of activity in the organization right now, and I'm trying to give you as much visibility with our global leadership as I can. We are engaged actually in just the last few months in the early stages of making some structural adjustments to the organization, to the staff organization as well as to the governance structure. To, as I put it, unlock ULI's global potential. If you look at our footprint currently, there's no question that we're global. We're active in about 75 countries. We're putting on over 3,000 events a year all over the world, very high quality. But there are some structural barriers to continuing to develop our global footprint, and I think that with some of these adjustments, we can unlock that. I won't go into the specifics, but the impacts, I think, will be threefold. One is that it's going to be easier as a ULI member to connect and contribute to the organization. I firmly believe that the power of ULI comes from its members, and it's all about leveraging the experience and the wisdom and the knowledge of our members, and we need to make it easy to contribute, and technology plays a really important role in that. But it also, you know, we need each member to understand that they're part of a global network of like-minded professionals all over the world, and you can plug into this system easily. The second is that the leadership pathways through ULI, which can be fairly opaque in its current form, you know, how can I contribute to the organization? How can I thrive as a leader in the organization? How can I move through the organization? That will all, we hope, become much clearer, and we'll have a firmer connection between our leaders and the program of work within a particular geography, whether it's a region or a country or a metro area. So leadership pathways, I think, will be clear. And you'll get more value, third, you'll get more value out of the staff team, top to bottom, from me all the way down to the district council assistants. We can be more efficient. We can deliver more value to our members for their dues contribution to the organization. So stay tuned for these impacts. I know that some of you in the room are not members of the organization. I would encourage you to consider membership. Again, ULI is really just nothing more than the sum total of our members' experience and knowledge and wisdom, and we need to access yours as well. So we've got a terrific panel, and I'm gonna stop all this, but the introductions that I will make will be very brief. There's more information in the app. The full bios are in the app. The topic of real estate and technology is a really fascinating one, and it's one that we've really been enthusiastic about supporting and exploring with the help of panelists like we have today. Many of you may have attended our San Francisco fall meeting. Now, San Francisco is a place that is a very interesting example of what's happening with real estate and technology these days, not only as the hub of technology and innovation, arguably in the world, certainly in the United States, but also a real estate market and a political dynamic around the use of technology and its disruptive capacity in land use and real estate that's really fascinating, and things are happening very quickly. But fundamentally, this is about reconciling what is a really slow-moving industry, a capital-intensive, slow-moving industry, where we build really long-lived assets in the context of very rapid technological change about how we use those assets, how we plan and design them, how we occupy them, how we manage them, how we invest in them, and so forth. So very, very rich topic for ULI. And a great panel to address that this morning. So to help us think this through, we have Jennifer Kiesmat, the Chief Planner, City of Toronto. On the far left, we have Steve Ladarante, who is the Head of Government Partnerships for Twitter Canada. That's less than 140 characters, that introduction. Colin McKay is the Head of Policy and Government Relations at Google Canada. Aaron Zifkin, Country Manager for Airbnb. And Ian Black, the General Manager for Uber. Disruptors all. So, Jennifer, let me hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Man, I love sitting on the stage with a bunch of disruptors. That's a great way to be introduced. This is an executive panel, as you will note, so it's going to be very interesting to see some of the visioning about the future, because that's really what this conversation is about this morning. It is about what will the future look like as a result of disruptive technology. Now, of course, we never know what the future will look like. This is a task that planners engage in all the time, and economists do as well, and they, of course, typically get it wrong. And in fact, there was a video produced in the 1950s by Disney that showed us what the bold future would look like. Some of you may have seen it, but it shows communities that are connected by superhighways, where we in fact don't ever need to get out of our pod, whether that's our home pod or our office pod, because we are zipped in driverless vehicles from point A to point B while food is served to us or we work. And what's interesting, if you see this video, is not really how much it got right, because it actually got a lot right. What's interesting is the parts that are missing. In the vision of the future where we zip on superhighways from point A to point B, no one envisioned a population that would become so inactive that obesity would become our #1 health risk. That wasn't part of the vision. It wasn't part of the vision that we would see an incredible growing divide between the rich and the poor. And in fact, in the city of Toronto specifically, when we look at the transformation that's taken place really over the last 20 years, which is the period where we've begun to see disruptive technologies introduced, it hasn't in any way alleviated, it's actually exacerbated this divide and inequity in our society. So I'd like to begin with just a high-level question around what we can expect from the future. And really, the question I have for you, and I know this is, of course, speculative. We don't expect you to look through a crystal ball. The question is, when we look at the future, will disruptive technologies transform how we design, build, and operate cities? Will they be transformative? Or are they just another layer, and we're going to continue to get some things right and some things wrong? And I think maybe we'll begin with you, Colin, and we'll just move down the line and have everyone answer that question, and then we'll move into a bit of a conversation.
Sure. I think the answer, quite bluntly, is yes. I think that something that's characterized as disruptive today is naturally leading to a very altered reality in the future. And what that means practically in a city like Toronto is where our experience used to be just within our local neighborhood, and we may actually be employed within the local neighborhood, the ability to build broader connections in both our immediate community and across the city means that we make decisions, whether it's as a consumer, as an employee, as an employer, to move around, because we can identify opportunities. We can identify whether it's restaurants, real estate opportunities, places where we see a greater concentration of skill sets that are necessary for our job. So to me, there's an underlying layer of easier, faster, and more in-depth communication among individuals that we're going to build this future society upon. And that's what they got right in the 50s. In the 50s, they imagined these transponder-like devices that we now all carry in our pockets today. The transportation via monorail on individual pods isn't necessarily true, but we may be looking to a world where there's multi-use pods that eliminate some of the traffic congestion we see on our streets and allow us to make better decisions about investment with our city, provincial, and federal money.
Great, thank you. Steve?
Oh, thanks. First of all, I apologize for breaking the disruptor dress code. I don't know if I'm allowed to disrupt anymore. But I think what we've seen, I come from a news background, and when you talk about disruption, the news industry has been hugely disrupted, of course, over the last 10 years, more than many others. And what's disrupted is the ability for people to have their voices heard immediately, and not only to be heard, but to be heard by a vast audience of stakeholders they would have never had contact with before. And as we look ahead, I think that really, some of the people that I follow on Twitter, for example, are people who live in Toronto in the depths of poverty, very infrequently leave their house, they have mental health issues, they have other health issues. They're not stuck in their house mentally, though. They're engaging with their community in ways they never had before. They have a voice. And I think, when you're talking about planning, when you're talking about, a building you're going to put up on a corner that you would have a little meeting for and 6 people would show up, 2 of them with signs. Now there's a conversation that can happen with thousands of people and actually affect where that all goes. So, the ability for people to be heard is very, very disruptive. It's very, very important. I think we're going to get more of that, and I think we also need to learn how to edit that and filter it so it's actually useful information and not just noise.
I really like that you brought up the example of kind of the city of the future, because for a long time I was viewed as the Jetsons city of the future. That same sort of image, and some of the similarities are there with the video you mentioned. But that view of everything just being so easy in the future didn't really feel like was achievable in cities even 5 or 10 years ago. But I think the story of the last 5 years, and certainly the story of the next 5 or 10 years, is much more so the internet and kind of the power of the technology we have today being applied to things and being applied to physical spaces. So it started with really the emergence of maps, and Google did this kind of amazing recasting of the world where all data existed and lived on maps, and that allowed us to use technology in the physical world. Uber, Airbnb, other companies like it are making the physical world much more accessible, and I think those changes that we'll see play out over the next 5 or 10 years are going to have profound impacts on cities and totally disrupt cities, where our traditional view of transportation, our traditional view of how various spaces are used publicly, of how much space we actually need for things like retail or industrial, all those things are going to change quite fundamentally as the pace of acceleration on technology interacting with the physical world really picks up over the next few years.
Great, thanks, Ian. Aaron?
So the term disruptive drives me nuts, and all of us at Airbnb. When you actually, like that vision that you painted of the future, there's one fundamental thing that I think we forget when we talk about technology and innovation. We always talk about capturing new efficiencies and the network effect of all this stuff, but we never talk about the human component. And when you actually think about what Airbnb is doing and these type of models, it actually predated the existence of hotels. This is a really, really old concept where people trusted each other, friends and family, in villages, right? That's how people started sharing homes and accommodation. And so for us, it's not necessarily disruptive. It might be the pace at which this is scaling, which is our ability to bring trust at scale around the world and have very far-reaching communities interacting with each other. But for us, the innovation is really just about bringing people back. And we talk about the vision of the future and technology's involvement in it. We talk about being so much more connected today, but the reality is, from a human perspective, we are so much more disconnected. And I think that's why a lot of these technologies that are coming up and scaling so quickly are actually allowing people to get that human connection again. And great disruptor uniform. Blue, but Steve will work on you. We'll work on you later.
Trying to think of a way to slip off my ties.
So I think you've raised an interesting question, which we should come back to, Aaron, which is, what is disruptive? Like, why are we using that kind of language to describe these technologies? I think that's a very important question to probe. In the opening comments that each of you made, there were a series of themes that I'd like to come back to again and again in this hour. One of the first that came up was around the importance of connection and how there's a role that technology plays around building connections that may not have existed in the past. in general. I think we think connecting is a good thing. So why is that something that's disruptive? We also heard from Steve about the opportunity for people who weren't previously heard to be heard. And I think that's a very interesting question around, particularly in a democracy. What is the opportunity for ideas and values that might otherwise be subverted to rise to the fore as a result of new technologies? That's a critical part of city building, is ensuring there's a diversity of voices at the table. And Ian, you raised the issue, which I think we don't talk about enough, but it's a critical part of what technology has always been about, which is about ease, making our lives easier. And what is the role that technology plays in building ease into our everyday lives? And then, of course, Aaron, you've raised the question of the human factor, and I think really all of this is about human lives and human interaction and how technology can play a role in bettering and advancing our cities, but also our societies and our democracies more broadly. So I'd like to come back. I'd like each of you to kind of keep those 4 themes in mind as you answer some of these questions. I do want to come back and talk a bit about what disruptive means, because this is a critical part of framing the overall conversation. Because if change makes our lives easier, is it disruptive? Is it disruptive simply because it's fundamentally new? It's something that we'd never conceived of doing in the past. And I'd like to propose that there are disruptions that come from technology that require us really to have new policy frameworks, that require us to think about the role of government in new ways, and that is part of where the disruption takes place. And just to use your example, Aaron, yeah, scale is disruptive. For example, if it now becomes, we've talked about this, if it now becomes more profitable to rent your house out on a nightly basis instead of a monthly basis, and as a result, you see housing stock that's only used 3 months of the year instead of 12 months of the year, and you see a portion of your housing stock disappear. And I don't mean to pick on Airbnb, but I just do think this is a really good example of an unintended consequence that becomes disruptive and has a profound implication on society. That's actually something that we need to talk about, because the scaling up, just the magnitude, and I really think that's probably the theme with all of the technologies represented here, it's the scale which starts to introduce some kind of disruption. I'm going to throw this out to whoever would like to begin, but I'd like you to just comment on this notion of what is disruptive, when is disruption good, when is it bad in cities? Go ahead, Colin.
I think you've hit on the 2 elements that prompt us all to consider disruption as potentially negative, which are that we find emotional stability in the reality we understand right now, and that we see as markets change, as technologies change, intergenerationally, we have a struggle adapting to the new behaviors and understanding them within that past context. And what that means in reality is that we have a regulatory framework that's built around reassuring us that what exists right now has our best interests in mind. And we live in that regulatory framework while we're making this transition to a new world. And you bring up a good point about housing stock. You could also make a similar argument about the taxi industry. You can make a similar argument about mapping. You can make that argument about any number of regulations. And we feel this personal conflict as we struggle to adapt to this tremendous piece of mobile technology that has fundamentally changed our lives in the last 5 years. And we could see the possibility. At the same time, we're also trying to deal with the emotional change and the instability that comes from whether it's dealing with your kids or your parents, their understanding how this is impacting their life. And we're really looking at a reevaluation of our relationship to technology, as well as a reevaluation of how we're conducting our everyday lives in a context where, for thousands of generations before, technological change was very gradual. So the pressure is really quite extreme, and that's why it feels so disruptive.
So it's not just the scaling up, it's the pace,
Yeah, very definitely.
how quickly it's happening.
I was commenting as we were talking before the session that I'm the middle-aged company on this panel. So we've been around for 17 years.
In 17.
Yeah, so.
Interesting. Others? What?
I think you touched on a great point, which is the pace at which this happens. Think about this for a second just to reframe the conversation. What if we called disruption innovation? right? A term that we're all comfortable with, a term that does have a positive connotation to it. And all of these innovations, they follow a certain cycle and a certain timeline, right? And it's generally, whatever that cycle is, 10, 15 years. Now we're seeing businesses that go from 0 to Mach speeds literally overnight, right? And so people are trying to grapple with this. So if there's anything that's disruptive, I think it's just that these patterns that all innovation goes through is just being hyper-accelerated. And that's a tough thing for people to understand. It's tough for the platforms that are introducing these businesses to understand because, as you alluded to, Jennifer, there's a lot of things that come up that you don't think about because it just didn't exist before. So I think if we look at it just from a sequencing of time, I think it'd be more digestible and people wouldn't be as sort of, the disruptors are coming.
Yeah, when we speak about emotions and the fear of the new technology as well, my father was a newspaper printer. That nobody does that anymore. My father-in-law was a cartographer, so thanks Google. And so you're always kind of looking over your shoulder now for that next innovation, and I don't think there's an industry anywhere that doesn't feel that coming on. So you mentioned that renting out your house to friends and family is something that was happened a long time ago and is just starting to come back. But the invention of the flamethrower wasn't any less impressive because they discovered fire in caves, before that, right? So it's just trying to figure out what that all means and where the next innovation comes. You look at, banking, very solid, stable industry. Micropayments are going to absolutely tear through that industry in the next little while, and the microloans and peer-to-peer lending. That's a whole industry just waiting to happen. So it's a constant case of these big companies rising very quickly, coming out of nowhere, and completely transforming. And I think, as you try to look out into what the next one is, it's very difficult because you just can't anticipate what's going to hit next.
I'll just
Go
build
ahead, Ian.
briefly on the point that Aaron made. And the pace is so remarkable, and I'll give you an example of that. Uber as a company is only about 5 years old, and we're already regularly having conversations saying, look out there in the market that this product that's coming up, if we don't do something to our business model, we're going to be disrupted in the next year or 2 years. So already in a span of 5 years, a company that traditionally is viewed as very innovative and disruptive is already at the point where new models are coming up and disrupting us. So that gives a sense for the pace of change. I think the big implications on regulation, which you brought up, are that in that environment, it's going to be impossible for us to have a regulatory framework where it's entirely prescriptive. It takes a set of facts of what we know and then creates a structure that works. Regulations in that world of innovation and constant disruption are going to need to be much more flexible and allow for future iterations to happen without always needing to write, new regulations. So I think it's a very interesting implication for that. Also, for anyone in the private sector here, fascinating how you organize as a company to keep up with that innovation, but that's a different conversation.
So this is interesting if we begin to use innovation and disruption interchangeably. I also think it's a little bit dangerous because the connotation behind disruptive is that there is something that's unsettling, right? It's causing us to regain our balance. And I think that's really what this is about. We're in the process of trying to regain our balance in light of this incredible change. I'd like to shift, and without talking about regulation, because I really don't want to go there, without talking about regulation, I want to talk a little bit about cities and disruption and government. And I'll tell you why. Cities really are a way that we organize ourselves. At the end of the day, we create cities, we create systems, whether it's for picking up the waste or ensuring people have housing and access to food or licensing for small businesses. We create systems in order to organize ourselves so that we can be fair. There's a bit of a redistributive component to the way we organize ourselves. There's a whole variety of mandates that have emerged very recently about our environmental footprint and mitigating our environmental footprint. So we have regulations around green roofs and building green buildings. But really, at the end of the day, if you strip it all away, really, cities are about organizing a lot of people around a shared interest. Now, what happens when, and this is where I think this is really the nub of the disruption, what happens when other people start organizing people? That's sort of what we're talking about here, right? The government's not doing the organizing anymore. There's And I want to get to the point of the public interest in this. I'm wondering if you can comment on that, because really what we're seeing here is a fundamental shift in roles, that as a result of certain technologies, a role that the government played in cities is now being taken over by private enterprise that has developed the technology to actually do what the government used to do, which was sort of organize people so that they could be effective. Could you comment on that idea? Do you think that's an accurate assessment of what's disruptive about some of the technologies we're talking about today? Ian, do you want to start with that?
I'll jump in because we really see it in our business. One of our core products that we don't yet have in Toronto, but hopefully we will soon, and we have around the world, is Uber Pool. So it's effectively technological. I've lost my.
No, you got it.
There we go. It's carpooling. So imagine you're.
Also
it's
a very
carpooling.
old idea.
Old idea, but it's effectively going from point A to point B. You open the Uber app, you say you're going along that route, and if someone else is going along that route, you'll be matched with them. So from a public point of view, this is fabulous. We've been trying to achieve carpooling for over 40 years. Finally, we have a technology that's enabling it to happen at scale, which we're seeing in cities like San Francisco. But it then opens up all sorts of questions. Well, what if rather than a 4-person vehicle, that were a 20-person vehicle? And then does that start to actually just look like public transit? And is public transit not the job of the municipal government? So certainly we're entering that era. That's going to happen more and more. And the question for cities is going to be, what do we allow to happen? Under what terms do we allow it to happen? And do we want to take the point of view that ideas and experimentation are a good thing, and we'll never get to a better state, or we'll never get better ideas on the table unless we allow things to happen? And so we need to find a way to do that, but it is easy to have the opposite reaction, which is, well, no, that's government's job, so private sector, get out of here, and government will take care of it. But that really shuts the door on a lot of improvement and innovation that can happen in the world.
So you would agree that really we're talking about a shifting in roles?
I think different areas, we certainly are. I mean, it'll happen more in some areas than others, but we've seen it in many industries over time. There's certain things that government traditionally had to do because there wasn't enough information and there wasn't enough connection between people in order for there to be proper oversight or regulation. But as technology gets much better at sharing information, at creating marketplaces, you no longer need the complex structures to organize certain activities. Now those can be effectively organized just by people, with technology being the connector.
Colin, did you want to weigh in on that?
Sure, and I'll pick up on Ian's last point about information. Because essentially, once we get information from individual citizens, whether it's about their political interests or about their transit habits, we have the ability to have greater insight into their standard behaviors and their exceptional behaviors within our city construct. And that impacts things like transit. It impacts things like our political participation. And especially it impacts the sort of work you do in trying to anticipate what is the infrastructure that the city has to build to support the individual citizenry. And the fundamental challenge that I see is actually one where the city through history has had to ebb and flow between being an extremely controlling organism, whether because society was under economic crisis or military crisis or there was political unrest, to one that's actually quite flexible and responsive to the needs of its citizenry. And we're going through one of these transitions now. We're going through a transition where, as a public servant, as a municipal employee, you're certainly open up to more comment and more criticism from individual citizens within the city. They're self-organizing to use services like the ones we're discussing on the dais today, but they're also self-organizing communities to address problems within their neighborhood, within the city, trying to arrive at solutions of their own. And that is a tremendous opportunity. So once again, we come to innovation versus disruption, because the ability to harness the interests of our citizens and to lay over detailed data about their actual behavior allows us to make much more sophisticated assumptions and long-term investments about the sort of frameworks, whether political or infrastructure, that are necessary to support their activity into the future. And that's where I see a real opportunity. It's, as Ian said, building on maps and growing from there, understanding what citizens are actually doing within the physical construct we have presented for them and how that needs to evolve.
So I'm going to come back to that idea in a moment, because I think there's a really important idea around the implication of having access to so much information, analysis, and whether we're actually getting to the objective of creating a society where everyone's included, where there's a really high level of social inclusion. I want to come back to that idea because I think it's a very important idea, but I don't want to leave an earlier idea that we were talking about, and I'm going to shoot this to both Aaron and Steve, which is, if there's this shifting of roles that's taking place right now, are we at risk, and in some ways it's kind of funny to ask this panel this question, but are we at risk that we're losing the notion of citizen, which is really about a sharing society, and simply becoming all consumers? We consume everything, which is the sharing economy. I'm wondering if you can talk about that as a risk in society, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of people in the City of Toronto right now who are left out of that narrative of moving more and more to a consumer-based model of government as opposed to one that's based on citizens and a recognition that everyone has certain rights to access certain services in order to live a fulfilling life. That tension, I'm wondering if you can speak to it a bit.
I think part of the assumption there is that everybody does have equal access to things, and they're able to tap into the services and are a part of that broader community. And when you look at, what happens with social media and all this information, is that's not actually the case in a lot of cases, right? There's people who don't feel included, and they've just been on their own all this time, and now they've been given voice to be part of the conversation and to say, like, wait a minute, like, the bus doesn't go down my road, and now everybody knows about it. Nobody knew about it a couple of months ago, but I'm able to tell the whole city now in a way that I couldn't before. So, the reason a lot of this stuff happens is, the disruption is that this is all pretty awesome stuff, right? It's filling a need. People want to be able to get from point A to point B without, worrying if the car's going to show up when it's supposed to or whatever. I want to be able to find a nice place to stay. I want to be able to communicate with the world. And, I think the danger of moving from consumer to citizen is a real one, but it's also, it's actually making people more of citizens because they're more engaged in the system than they would have been before, and they're able to find like-minded people who are able to share their concerns and actually do something about it. So they're becoming more engaged, perhaps in many cases.
I think we talk about, a lot of time you hear about this, the democratization of businesses. And, going back to what you were pointing to before, the idea of government, putting in systems in place to organize, or is it the platforms? I actually think there's another layer, which is probably the most important layer, which is a lot of the time the reason why there's such a groundswell and these businesses are growing so fast, it's the actual people that are using these platforms and grabbing onto them. The platforms are not what makes these companies grow. It facilitates it. That's all the technology is doing. It's taking existing offline behaviors that people really, really want and just putting it on steroids, right? That's what the platforms are doing. And so when you think about things like, home sharing or ride sharing or, sharing, people teaching or sharing their knowledge, these things are now happening at scale because of the technology, and people are able to grab onto it.
I might jump in with,
Sure.
with just one comment, because I think it's a interesting assumption that the shift to consumerism is it a shift towards better access for a lot of people. Because what we see very convincingly in a lot of cities with transportation, as Uber is introduced to cities, and especially our peer-to-peer UberX product, which is regular people using their vehicles to provide transportation, we actually see much better transportation in areas outside the core where these people who are driving live. So under traditional system, many of them were in transit deserts, or they were in areas where taxis wouldn't go. But now by, in a sense, consumerizing it or democratizing it, we're actually providing better service in those areas and at a lower cost. And we see that in accessible transportation as well. I mean, won't pick on Toronto, but there's a lot of cities around the world who have public access transportation for the accessibility community, and it looks good from afar, but you talk to anybody who uses it, and it's a terrible user experience. We're able to help improve that through technology and through making those folks consumers. So I would challenge a bit the sense that we can't improve outcomes and we can't improve accessibility by shifting to that consumer mindset.
So I've pulled out a false dichotomy. On the one side, citizens, on the other side, consumers. What you're suggesting is they're actually, it's much more kind of twisted up together. That might be true. I'd like to just come back to this issue of data and analysis and the opportunity that it presents. And I should say, just as a point of process, that we're going to continue to chat for about 15 more minutes, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions. So if you have a question, by all means, jot it down. We're very interested in getting a response and some interaction from the audience. What I'd like to do is, and this, it makes sense to start with you, Colin, because you are sort of the granddaddy on the stage of technologies. I'd like to do two things in our last 15 minutes. I want to look back and I want to look forward, because I think we've been kind of trying to figure out what it is we're talking about, defining some of the language. But just looking back, if we look at what's happened with Google, and your company, of course, has continued to evolve and is something very different than it was 17 years ago. What do you think the impact of Google has been? And I want you to link this in with the issue that you raised of data and the opportunity for transformation. How has it changed us? How has it changed how we live in cities? How has it changed how we work? How has it changed how we interact? And I'm asking this question because it's really about trying to understand what some of the principles are that we can anticipate will bring into the future.
We've done a lot of thinking in this, and we've come up with a term called micro moments. And those are the moments where hundreds of times a day, you're making a decision about the options that are presented to you. And you're often making those decisions informed by technology. And for example, I got up this morning, got in my car, and immediately turned on Waze, which is a mapping service that we own. I'm sorry, Steve, we own 2 mapping services. And Waze presented options for me to commute to this building. But they were constantly evolving options as I was driving. As you probably know, they react to traffic signals provided by other people's phones and other people's vehicles, and they try to optimize my route to save time or other sets of conditions that I may give Waze. And these are the sort of transactions that we go through every day when we're walking down the street and we're looking at our phone and communicating with others. We're using this device to inform the decisions we take through the day, and we're using it to plan out what we're going to do tomorrow. And that's the evolution that has happened that, as I said earlier, is causing stress on a continuing basis for many people in several generations, mine included. But it's also a pointer to this bridge between citizenry and consumerism that you've identified, because the interactions that I have as an individual are both among my close family members, but they're also among associated interest groups. And then specifically, and more of interest to Google, in certain instances, I'm looking to buy something, I'm looking to make a decision in future planning. And these micro moments are the places where I'm using the technology available to me to make a decision to affect either the immediate future or the near future. You've hinted at it a couple of times, and we haven't really touched on an answer to it, the question of accessibility across economic groups, and whether or not there's exclusion among different communities within the city or within Canada. And that's a challenge around the world, but what we're seeing is people recognizing that there is a solution of some sort to their need to interact with technology and participate in this new way of communicating, whether that's through low-cost home internet service or low-cost handheld devices. That technology is evolving at a far greater pace in the developing world and transitioning into Canada. We still have a gap, and we have a price pressure or a budget pressure because communities, especially in urban areas, have a fixed budget, and these are increasing pressures. Where we're seeing the transition is that we're now in a phase as a society of making conscious decisions how we collect and sort information. And where we used to just get fed information through a pipe, through our cable or through our television, we're now opting to allocate some of our budget to devices that will deliver the information we're looking for, phones, home computers. And the key there is to make sure that that network is as efficient and cost-effective as possible, and the devices to access it are easily available and also very, very cost-efficient.
So fair enough, a fundamental assumption of everything that you've said is that more is better. More information even the changing changing routes along the way. More is good. Is it? Is more good? Is more
jump in there.
is more information better? Have our lives, if we look back over the past 10 years, have our lives become better, or have they become more frenetic than they've ever been? You know, email was supposed to save us, right? We would work shorter hours because of email. Well, who did that materialize for? Most of us are completely buried under email. It's an absolute disaster. So I'm just, I'm not sure that that assumption that more is better. And interestingly, we've actually seen the flip side. We, of course, just had a really good run with our Blue Jays in this city. And the mayor created a bird's nest at Nathan Phillips Square where people could stand outside and watch the game together. And it was so interesting to me. I was often in the office late, and people were out there watching this game, and it was like cold or rainy, but people were gathered in that square because they wanted to be together. They didn't want to sit alone and have access to information from their living room. They wanted to be together. And I think that's a very interesting counterpoint to the assumption that getting more and more individualized way is a good thing.
So there's a billion tweets sent every 2 days around the world, so that's a lot of information. And I think what we're seeing in all technology, and not just us, but a move toward curation and human intervention in the data that's being created. So if the last 10 years of Twitter, it's 10 years in a little while, so I'm not quite a granddaddy yet, but we'll get there, has been about giving people the ability to share all that information and to just pump it out in an incredible pace. We've never had access to real-time information the way we do now. I can find out what's happening next door, across the street. I find out about breaking news events from the people that are in the room where it's happening. When the Ottawa shootings happened last year, there were MPs tweeting at their mothers from underneath desks. It's a huge amount of information, but you get lost in all that information. It can be too much. So I do think the trend over the next year, maybe the next 5 years, is kind of stepping back and building in a sense of human curation, having human beings actually take that information and package it up in a way that we could actually consume, so we could all take that step back and actually start to benefit from all that information and not just have it wash over us and sort of slap us in the face all day long.
I think it's how people are using the information. One of the interesting things that we're seeing now is we actually have cities contacting us, asking us for access to our information because they're trying to figure out when are people descending upon the city. We just had an announcement yesterday where we partnered up with Winnipeg and the CFL. They didn't have enough accommodation to host it, and we want small Canadian cities to be able to have that type of supply elasticity to host these type of events. Well, this type of model actually now affords people or cities the opportunity to host large events without having that huge constraint be placed on the city. And we're seeing other things too pop up, like naturally, sometimes there's challenges and sometimes there's also opportunities. During Hurricane Sandy, we had 1,400 of our hosts reach out to us and want to open up their homes for free. And so now we're seeing emergency planners across the country reaching out to us to try and get our host community, who are some of the best ambassadors in these cities, to open up their homes and just be at the ready at the flip of a switch.
And to your point that people do want to interact, people want to come together. We're seeing that a lot, and that I think goes to the point I made earlier about now we're using technology to connect with the physical world in totally new ways. So as we see the growth of Uber, it's not as though Uber is just displacing the taxi industry. We're seeing Uber grow to a size that's much larger than taxi or other for-hire transportation was. And what that signals to us is there was an appetite for lower-cost transportation because people want to be out in their cities and people want to be out interacting more. And I think one of the biggest contributions we're making as a company, we're really only starting to make this, but it's our goal to do longer term, is to get rid of the personal car and make transportation totally accessible to people so that transportation is no longer a significant cost or in many cases a big investment of time. And we can use technology to get there and have a lot of the social benefits, I think, that you highlighted on that we're trying to get to. We can use technology to get there.
So that leads in very nicely to what I'll call my future question, which is about a couple of things. One, it's about ideally we move to a model where technology is constantly building efficiency. Someone has a home, the home is sitting empty. Instead of sitting empty, someone's sleeping in the bed, the home is being used. So the asset is being better used. I'd like to frame kind of thinking about the future and what the future holds around autonomous vehicles or driverless cars. And you've hinted at this already. one of the great opportunities, I think, of driverless cars is, in fact, that we no longer need to own vehicles, that we move away from a model. In fact, I believe that within our lifetimes, we'll look back and we'll say, remember when people spent like thousands and thousands of dollars on cars that sat in their driveways and that they only drove 4% of the time? By the way, that's the average number that we drive our cars, 4% of the time. So this notion of a future where there's just much more precision and much more efficiency with respect to the way that we use resources. Driverless cars might be a really critical part of that. I'd like to have each one of you just kind of comment, when you look out, and it's so hard to talk about 50 years when you look at what's happened in the last 10, but look out, choose your time frame, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. How are our cities different? What has changed? How are they fundamentally different from what they are today as a result of what we're calling disruptive technologies? Maybe we'll start with you again, Colin.
So I'll anchor on the point you brought up on autonomous vehicles, where the advantage that we have a problem in that over the past 50 years, we've included vehicles as part of an extension of our personal identity. So the marketing of vehicles is very much how do you express yourself to the people immediately beside you on the road and the people in your community. And you're right, it's a horrible sunk cost. It has very little return on its investment. And then it has an extreme cost for society. One of the reasons that Google got into autonomous vehicles is simply because the founders found it shocking that the American healthcare system is straining under the cost of the impact of poor driving. Whether that's actually in physical terms, in terms of accidents and deaths, but even more so in terms of long-term impact on the healthcare system. As well, in San Francisco and the Valley, in Toronto, the impact of congestion, both on the mental well-being as well as the health of urban dwellers, has this incredible sunk cost that forces us to make poor decisions, both around our transit planning as well as our infrastructure investment over the long term. So we start talking about things like congestion charges in urban areas to try and regulate that behavior around the individual vehicle, where really, as Ian suggests, we should be exploding that entire framework, and we should be moving to a world where the vehicle is available on demand as you need it in the size and in the capacity that you need it, whether it's a 1 or 2 person pod or it's a vehicle for transporting your groceries. I had this conversation with my daughter who goes to U of T, and she has an auto share car in the parking lot of her apartment building, and she's too young for a credit card. And she said to me, well, you know, eventually, do you think there'll be autonomous vehicles, Dad? And I said, yes. And I gave it a 10-year window. I think that's ambitious, but they're already on the road. And she said, so this car would be sitting in the parking lot, and I would dial it up on my mobile device, and it would come pick me up and take me to the Loblaws at Carlton and Yonge. And then it would wait for me. I'm like, no, it would not wait for you. It would leave. And this is the jump we have to make.
Thinking.
It's the old thinking, which is the sunk cost waits for you, and then the convenience is solely dependent on your knowing where the transportation is. Where in the world where we've managed to leap past this perception that we own the modes of transportation and it's relying upon us, and in fact we have a wholly reliable system of transportation, not only allows us to break out of this framework in terms of our personal investments, but what it means for cities in terms of making better investment decisions. Imagine Queen Street without individual cars. You know, that pressure from Liberty down to downtown is gone. Even if you have 1/4 the number of autonomous vehicles. And the pressure that creates both on investment at the provincial level and the federal level in terms of healthcare costs, you have hundreds of millions of dollars a year that can be spent on something else, that can actually be spent on social inequality, rather than simply compensating for human error, because honestly, everyone in this room is a bad driver. None of us are good at it. We think we are, but we're not. So.
And the data bears that out.
Yeah.
Autonomous vehicles are,
Well,
the
unfortunately,
safety is-
you look at University Avenue, and that is the data point that just drives that message home. Because the long-term cost of road vehicle accidents is a significant component of government expenditure. So you start eroding at that, and you have tremendous flexibility in your budgets where you can make better decisions that impact society as a whole. So.
Steve, the future.
I-
What does it look like?
This will forever be remembered as the time somebody asked Twitter about what's going to happen 2 minutes from now, let alone 10 minutes. It's, we think in pretty short little bursts, but you know, a lot of what Colin said is true, and I think the move towards artificial intelligence in general is going to, be a big part of whatever is going to happen. I think we're just, when we talk about disruptive things, we're still in the very, very early days of autonomy, and we're talking about cars, and we're assuming they're not going to rise up and destroy us. But assuming that goes well, that moves into other industries, and it moves into other other things. You could have autonomous waiters, autonomous chefs, autonomous grocery store clerks. We haven't even got there yet. But when you look at innovations and disruptions that are going to happen over the next 10 years, there's no doubt that's coming. And sort of the virtual reality. You look at Oculus Rift and Google Cardboard. All these different things that are just starting to bubble up now, and we're kind of talking about them as if they're magical things that aren't really going to turn into something, but they're going to disrupt things in a huge way, and I think that's going to start to happen probably in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I'll build a bit on the transportation piece, because I think this concept that we'll get to much more efficient road system is not a 50-year thing. It's probably a 10-year thing. And does it even rely on autonomous vehicles in many ways? Because if we think about the technology we have today, which can match people and put them in a car, you can roughly replace 40 cars with one if it's running kind of in the model as described, where everybody gets in, they go to their destination, they get out, and people trust in that system. And we're starting to see that being adopted in San Francisco and more in other cities. So we build from there. Then we have all this parking infrastructure that all of a sudden frees up. We have all this road infrastructure that frees up. Even with increased population, we have all this road infrastructure. Then there's also an interesting question for retail spaces, because if we have this amazingly efficient road network, truly a network, no longer people driving cars, then why do we have retail stores at all when you can get anything you want delivered in an instant? So I think as soon as the transportation piece comes into reality, it's going to be a very interesting transition for physical retail as well, because a local business, and we see this, Uber Eats is a product we have that delivers food typically in about 5 minutes, but the promise is under 10 minutes. And we're seeing restaurants set up on the Uber Eats platform that don't have a physical storefront. They just use Uber Eats as delivery. So that'll have a very interesting impact on a lot of businesses, but also then the physical space that businesses occupy as well.
Jeremy, I'm going to go back to your eBay example, which I loved. I think we're going to have a bigger focus on experiences, real-world experiences. It's taken Airbnb 4 years to get to 1 million guests, and on August 8th, we had 1 million guests in a single night, and that number is continuing to accelerate. And when you look at the demographic who's traveling on Airbnb, these are pretty plugged-in, technology, the millennials, and the number one reason why they travel on Airbnb is because they want to have a real and local, an authentic experience. And so I think you'll see this idea of, ownership, which has been ingrained in us, sort of turn the tide toward sharing and the different type of models that will present itself. We're starting to see blips of it now where people are starting to buy places with the idea that they're going to share their home, and so they're looking for buildings that are home sharing friendly. And I think we'll see that continuing, that trend of people wanting to invest in things that will afford them the opportunity to have experiences.
It's funny, I was in Abu Dhabi a couple of weeks ago, and I met an expert in tourism, and there was a whole initiative around building tourism in Abu Dhabi, and he kept talking about how the future of tourism is authenticity. It's all about creating authentic experiences for people, which of course immediately you see how that unravels. You're trying to create something that's authentic in a world that has increasingly become completely inauthentic. And I think that that's actually one of the risks that we haven't talked about when we look into the future, and I'm glad that you raised experiences. And it's a point where I would differ with you, Ian, is that we've had internet shopping for quite some time now, but if you go down to Yorkdale or you go down to the Eaton Centre, you'll see people are thronging to places where other people are, both to be around other people, but also to touch and feel real things and to see real things in an environment where our world has increasingly become more and more abstract. And I think that it's critical to go back to one of the very important themes that was raised at the beginning around people. And cities have always been about people. Cities have been about people gathering. They've been about people sharing. They've been about people communicating. And I think when we look out to the future and what the future holds, it's really critical to hold out technology as an overlay that can add ease, it can add information, it can make connections, but at the end of the day, the human experience is what's going to hold cities together. I'd now like to turn the floor open to questions. I'm not sure if there's microphones. Are there microphones out on the floor? Yes, I see microphones being waved around. So throw your arm up in the air if you would like to ask a question. And we'll get a microphone over to you. Keep your hand up in the air if you could. That would be helpful. And why don't we begin right here in the center of the room? Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name's DeVelle Morrison. I'm with Bosley Real Estate, and my question is for Aaron from Airbnb. I love the service. I use it when I travel. However, I am also president of my condo corporation in Toronto, and most condo declarations have it in them that you cannot rent out a space for less than 6 months. And I know other condos have been having that same experience where you've got not just owners, but tenants actually going on Airbnb and renting out their space. So I guess my question to you is that, in your website, is there something that you can do where you ask people the question that to make sure, A, are they actually owners renting out their space?
So first of all, thank you for using Airbnb. That's awesome. So we do tell everybody before they sign up that they obviously need to check with their local laws and regulations. The condo boards are an area that, that we're growing into right now. They're legitimate concerns, obviously, when you're talking about sharing a space within a space. One example, obviously, has been a big concern around liability insurance in buildings. And as of last week, we launched a liability program that covers all of our host community, their neighbors, but also in some instances their landlords as well. So I think these programs will continue to develop as well.
Great, thank you. Over here.
Hi, my name's Mary Francis, and I'm very interested in what is the role of government in this new world that we're colliding together in. And so my question to you is, if there were 3 things government could do for you today, what would they be? And I'd be interested in hearing from the different panel members.
Great. So if there are 3 things government could do for you today, what would they be? Whoever would like to go first?
I'll go first.
I thought you'd jump on that one.
I was going to start
The
with
golden
one.
question.
That
Yeah.
would be fabulous.
I'll take a stab. I'm thinking of 2 right now. I'll see if I can think of a 3rd one. The first is, it was hinted at earlier, the frameworks we have now around understanding markets are based on an understanding of the past. And they need to be more principles-based and try to build an environment where you can innovate and you can create new industries and encourage new behaviors, so that government isn't acting as a restraint on innovation. Secondly, there needs to be a greater understanding in government about the pace of change in technology. In one of our first questions, we all spoke about how we are all relatively new companies that everyone considers a threat to their fundamental businesses, yet all of us start every day thinking, how is our business being undermined? And how are we preparing for the future? And how are we going to map out 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? And that's part of what makes us innovative businesses. Understanding that this is the reality of the technology space, and in many ways how our services are interacting with individuals, is fundamental for governments. They need to know that change is constant for us, and it's going to become a constant for the larger business community. And I'll stick with 2
Because you have 2.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Ian?
I'll jump in and I mean, this is obviously a burden on both sides, but I think there's really a possibility for government to be more cooperative and more open, not just from a regulatory point of view, but from a partnership point of view when new technologies come around. So a great example is in the city of Boston, Uber has been working with the city to share much of our data around what routes are used at what times, and you can imagine how that data could be immensely powerful from a city planning point of view. We've tried to do the same thing in other cities around the world, and cities have actually said, no, we don't want that data because we have concerns about your model more generally. I think a more open attitude might be, you know what, there's concerns, but there's also ways to work together. So let's work together in places where we can, and by doing that, forge partnerships with industry, which can probably lead to more productive outcomes. So I could say the same thing. I think our company in our industry could probably also much more open, but I think the same could be said of government as well.
I'll just do one quick one. I think understand how it affects, don't focus on the technology, understand how it affects the citizens. Understand how it affects the people that are using it, the local businesses, and the type of impacts it's having, both from an economic, a social, and an environmental standpoint. Don't get so fixated on the technology itself.
Steve, did you want to weigh in as well?
That was like 6 things. I think we're good.
But I think kind of the underlying theme on the flip side, I'll represent the public sector side in the response here, is that there is a need to be deeply sensitive to the public interest. And so, whereas you might call for more openness, there is an inherent conservatism which is about ensuring that, for example, people are safe. And that is an obligation of the government, is to ensure that the broader public interest in whatever way is being protected. And I think that, well, we know bureaucracies by default are not inherently adaptive organizations. They change very slowly, and I think one of the things we're going to actually see over the next 5 years is bureaucracies need to function in a completely different way. One of the stories I love to tell is actually about Twitter, because when I started at the City of Toronto, I was told, yeah, sorry, senior bureaucrats can't tweet. And I said, well, I don't want the job then, and it was about access. It was about being able to not, be completely unfiltered in the kind of conversation that I was able to have with residents of the city, and to provide access to anyone in the city who wants to send me a message or send me a note can actually do that through Twitter. Like, the level of access I saw as being totally disruptive. But it took the city had a very hard time getting their heads around that idea that anyone could send me a tweet and that I could throw my opinion out into the universe unabated. So I think that there's the notion of being open is something that is inherently challenging for an organization that's built on being protectionist in a certain way. So I think that we're going to see a real transformation as maybe cities like Boston lead the way in being able to think in a fundamentally different way about these technologies. Was there another question out in the audience? In the center, go ahead.
Hi, David Tickall, University of Toronto. I'd like to pick up on Steve's point about the, what did you call it, the automation of everything, or the, what was it, the?
Yeah, that's basically the automated
Automation of
everything.
Yeah. And Jennifer's first question about unintended policy consequences, and put those two together. So when those two things happen, one potential policy-related consequence for cities and for many other governments is the impact on employment and economic inequality. Transportation alone, I believe the second largest employment sector, occupation in the country is truck driver, for example, but that's only one of many. If we get rid of all those retail stores, we'll get rid of all those retail employees, and so on. So any thoughts on that? And it's really not your job to figure that out, but going back to Jennifer's first question about the policy issues that cities inevitably face, what are your thoughts about that?
I'll jump in very briefly. I mean, it's a fabulous question, and I mean, to your point, one thing that we can't know is exactly what form all these changes are going to make. But we do know the labor market is undergoing a fundamental change right now, and will continue to over the next few years. One of the things that we see a lot in our business, which gives us hope around that, is even while there's automation and there's change, what we're seeing very clearly in our business is by creating a new model, which does disrupt an old model, no doubt, but it's unleashing all this new economic activity, and as a result, creating a whole new type of work that people are using very flexibly, and people are using in a way that fits much better with their life. So for those of you who have used UberX before, maybe you've spoken with your driver, and there's 20,000 in the City of Toronto. And these are people who almost all have a job, but they don't have enough time and they don't have enough money in their life. So they can't get another job, but they also need more money. So they can use UberX as a way to supplement their income and do so in a way that works with their life. That's a huge change in the nature of work, no doubt, but it is having a very positive impact on the lives of those people who are able to take part in it. So I think as we see this kind of innovation and disruption happen, it's easy to look at the downside, and it's easy to see all the things that we'll lose. What's less obvious, but almost a constant in all this change, is that there's a bunch of upside that we don't focus on, but is certainly there. And I think the UberX drivers are a great example.
And if I can add, just part of the challenge in that transition is the fundamental conversation around skills. And as we're contemplating a labor market where you may have multiple jobs or multiple professions that take advantage of all your skill set and the resources available to you, you really need to tackle digital literacy at its most fundamental levels, from the beginning of education all the way through as continuing education through your career. And it's something that we just haven't managed to handle successfully. It's really still a stopgap approach based on volunteer organizations, people like Ladies Learning Code and other groups within communities, within cities that are trying to bridge this space between the traditional educational model and being digitally literate, and by that I mean numerate, as well as having an understanding of the framework through which you interact with digital devices and with technology. But there are a couple of areas of optimism in this transition to an economy that is more automated, that relies on more data to make what seem to be very traditional roles obsolete. And the two of those are, the practical application of autonomous vehicles in Canada is taking place right now on the tar sands in northern Alberta. They're taking deliveries of these tremendously huge trucks that are self-driving within a very limited environment. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, farmers in Saskatchewan and in Manitoba are driving the most complex pieces of technology ever provided to humans. And these are people who have high school plus college degrees. But the level of numeracy you need to have to be a successful farmer in the international economy today, it would startle most of us in this room because we think we're pretty adept at computers. But the layers of data necessary to run a farm effectively and compete on the international level is pretty stunning. But this is a place where we need to commit both resources, time, and understanding to be able to bridge to this new economy. And this is part of where, coming back to disruption, we have this sense of being unsettled and we have this sense of anxiety. Because even the people in this room who chose to come to this panel aren't quite certain about their interaction with technology that they currently possess and aren't quite certain about the future, let alone that for their parents, their grandparents, or their kids.
So I'd like to probe this just a little bit deeper because it is such a critical issue. We know in the City of Toronto over the past decade, technology has become more and more a part of our life, but we also know that part-time work has become a bigger part of the employment in the city. And we also know that the fastest growing socio-economic group is in fact the poorest. The middle class is disappearing, and then on the other end of the spectrum, the high earners, that group is growing as well, which essentially just leads to the trend seen in major cities all over the world, which is this widening gap between the rich and the poor, the disappearing middle class. All that has happened as technology has become a more and more central part of our lives. At the same time, it strikes me as this incredible contradiction that we have young people coming out of school who are incredibly savvy when it comes to technology, but in fact, they're the least employable group at all, of all. Youth unemployment in this city is really at a crisis proportion, and it's something that a lot of public policy folks are spending a lot of time talking about. But those are the folks that have the best skills when it comes to technology, and yet they're the ones that are not able to access employment. How do you figure that? How does that work? What's going on here?
I would differentiate the assumption that they have the best skills. I would say that that generation just coming out of school now, millennials, are adept at using technology. But in terms of having the skills that allow them to take on specific roles in a world that is dominated by understanding and implementation of technology, they may not necessarily have that baseline. And I'm not talking specifically about coding or maintenance of machines. Being able to understand and apply their skills in an algorithmic world, in a world where the understanding of how artificial intelligence is driving decision-making will affect fundamental ways in which we do work. So that we're still in that transition point, and it is extremely painful. In terms of the economic disparity, I would say that the introduction of the internet through quite a bit of hard work by the Government of Canada in the mid-90s gave us the opportunity to break down traditional models of regional economics, where you were limited in terms of your growth as an individual and a business by the client base and your understanding of the market that was in your geographic proximity. And the opportunity to actually break out into a national and a global market is available to an individual or a business or a sector. And part of the challenge we have as an economy, and I'm returning to a very tired conversation, is that there's a lack of ambition in a certain part to really try to break out and take those risks. That doesn't address the concerns of the individual person who's either underemployed or unemployed, but it does point to the opportunity to grow a business at a far faster rate than was possible in previous generations.
I've just been told to go ahead. So
Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see
Good
you there.
morning. I'm Jamie Tate, and my question relates to government regulation. And I'm wondering how our government, be it locally at the Toronto level or the provincial level or the federal level, has been proactive or restrictive for your businesses in a relative context to globally. So how is doing business in Toronto and Ontario and Canada better or worse than doing business elsewhere internationally? And it's for the entire panel. Thank you.
So let's begin with focusing on the federal role. Is there a federal role? What has the federal role been? Has the federal regulation impacted you in some way? Why don't we begin with you, Aaron?
We have more municipal and provincial conversations than we do federally. There's obviously a conversation around income tax and declaring tax and that type of conversation. But just to go back to your question, I've been quite encouraged by the City of Toronto. They've been fairly progressive. I think they're going through the right exercises and information gathering right now at all levels across different municipalities. It's a tough conversation. I mean, we're in 34,000 cities now around the world, and each one of them, unfortunately, there's not a silver bullet, and so the conversations have to happen in each of them. There are some cities that we could point to, like France, Amsterdam, even Seoul, Korea, that are really very progressive. And they've had huge signals from the government at all levels saying we want to be known as a shared city, and that involves every single ministry within the organization, and they're funded and they've got staff against it, so it's a huge movement. So I think it is a huge spectrum, but Toronto right now I'm very encouraged with the conversations that are happening, and I'm looking forward to it. Toronto's actually a top 10 city around the world for home sharing, and before we even opened up an office here last year, we had over 1 million Canadians use Airbnb. So it's quite exciting.
Now, Steve, is this relevant to you in any way, as in the Twitterverse?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we're very fortunate in Canada in that, probably our biggest regulatory problem right now is that members of parliament still aren't sure whether they have to tweet in both official languages or not. That's a real thing. So if that's your biggest regulatory problem, it's not bad. There are countries where you can go to jail for using Twitter. There are countries we're not on the ground because the government restricts the sharing of information, so we're engaging with those governments. Those aren't the conversations we have to have in Canada. The overlap we have with government tends to be around law enforcement. How do you get information if you're trying to find someone? We work very closely with those agencies, and it's a good relationship. But, so we don't face those same sort of regulatory pressures on a day-to-day basis.
Great. We're going to go back out to the floor. There's in the front here. Great, thank you very much. For those who maybe couldn't hear, the question was about the use of the various platforms in cities versus suburbs and whether there's in fact a difference, recognizing that these are often recognized as urban technologies and urban platforms, and it's a question about who your users are and where they're located. Let's hear from the panel. Ian?
Yeah, I'll jump in because it's in the context of the GTA, the Greater Toronto Region. Our fastest growing areas right now in the city are North York and kind of the outer edges of Mississauga. And so those are very much more suburban communities. And then as you look across the whole country, the fastest launch, or the second fastest launch we've had in North America has been Kitchener-Waterloo. A city, but not a huge urban city. So we're actually seeing this technology, despite the natural presumption is Uber is all millennials in a dense urban core kind of using this to get around. But we're actually seeing, because transit options are much worse in suburbs, because there's fewer taxis, and because people actually are craving more social interaction and more connection, we're seeing higher growth in those areas. So it's a counterintuitive, but I think also the case for connection to public transit. A lot of our users in those areas are using Uber as first mile, last mile. And so that's really exciting to us, but I also think as we look at the implications for cities, really important.
That's a
And
great point.
go ahead, Aaron.
We actually have 76% of our listings in Toronto are outside of the downtown district. So way in the suburbs. And one of the exercises I did very early on at Airbnb, I asked one of our analysts, can you tell me where people are traveling to from Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal? Where's their first Airbnb trip happening? And when he came back, he said, in Toronto, it's Toronto, and in Montreal, it's Montreal, and Vancouver, it's Vancouver. And I said, there's got to be something wrong with the data. And he said, no, we see this across all the cities. And so we spent some time thinking about, like, what's the hypothesis behind this? And we realized it's probably friends and family, and I'm not commenting on your in-laws out there, but probably when you have in-laws that are coming into the city and you're in an area that isn't serviced by a traditional accommodation provider, it's a great model. We actually see that over a third of people traveling on Airbnb would not have taken their trip or stayed as long if it wasn't for Airbnb. And a lot of the time, I think it's that point that you're alluding to, they're in an area that is outside that's traditionally serviced, and you might probably stay with friends or family if they like you.
What about tweeters? Do you have some demographics on tweeters?
Yeah, there's not the big divide, urban city, to suburban, where you do see a split as sort of urban to very rural. My favorite Twitter account is a sheep farmer in England, and he's in the field and he just tweets about it all day. So it does connect people that are, I know, there's more to it than that, I assure you. Not a lot more, but that's kind of the beauty of it, right? Is it allows people to connect with something that they would never otherwise have a window into. Allows him to connect with the world, the urban world, frankly, that he has no access to either. So you do see that, but not so much a concentration of use based on urban, suburban.
And from my experience, it's more anecdotally, but it's I've lived in a suburb for 18 years now, 20 kilometers from Ottawa, with exactly the commute that Ian's describing. Just before I joined Google, I moved into a new house. And for the first few months, I got the feeling that my neighbors were giving me the shifty eyes because I wasn't following the regular patterns of leaving the suburb at 6 in the morning and coming back at 6 in the evening because I had to adapt to the transit schedules. And I finally had to go around and explain to them that thanks to the miracle of the internet, I could work from home. And I could actually phase my transit based on what information I had about transit congestion or make the decision to work from home. And it's actually a fundamental observation about the ability to conduct your business or to live your life without having to have that hub and spoke be the essential part of your daily practice and your daily habit. Then in fact, you can have your hub be within that suburban community if it has the capacity. That's the major failing of suburbs in Canada. But that you now have the tools available to you to conduct that business without actually leaving your home.
You really got shifty eyes in Ottawa?
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
disappointed.
In suburbs, yeah. They're all shifty eyes.
One more question, right in the center here. The floor is yours.
Hi. Actually, my question is related to the whole urban planning thing. So we have an emergence of analytics and data, and it is a good tool to support urban planners. I'm working on a paper on doing the same for civic engagement, for allowing communities to have a voice because they don't usually have that, sort of data activism kind of thing. And I'm working with the open data that is available from the City of Toronto. I'm trying to connect it with other data. Companies like Google, Twitter, and other companies, of course, have a lot of data that I can use. The case I have that I'm looking at is a company wants to put a condo somewhere, and the community is thinking, is this good for us or not? And they're concerned about traffic. We don't have historic traffic from that area. The historic traffic exists at Google, but it is not public. Is there a way that the cities and Google and Twitter can make certain data open, just like the city makes certain data open to the public, can make certain city data open to the public? So I'm not looking at the whole Twitter feed from the last 10 years, but for the City of Toronto Twitter feed from the last 10 years, and it will be available for the City of Toronto. Is there a way that maybe governments and companies can work to make that available to us?
Sure.
Great question.
Yes.
Yes.
And Ian mentioned their project in Boston, which is just one of those examples. And our mapping subsidiary, our traffic subsidiary, Waze, does the same thing. They have a connected cities program, where if cities want to enter into an agreement around the sharing of the data, because we need to ring fence it so that we continue to maintain the trust of our users, that the city can get greater insight into how commuters and transit users are moving the community.
One of the things about Twitter that's sort of magical is that everything's public, right? So 99% of our accounts aren't locked; they're open. So that data is all available to anybody who wants it. If you're going further back, you may incur a cost to access it, and there may be other barriers, but they're not huge barriers. So generally speaking, anything that's ever been tweeted is accessible to you today as it was on the day it was sent.
Aaron, did you want to respond? You've got data where people are going, where they're coming from.
Yeah. So again, we haven't opened it up yet, but we're working very closely with many cities. Last year in the World Cup was really interesting. We had in Brazil, there was over 20% of people that visited Brazil for the World Cup stayed on an Airbnb, and the cities were short of accommodation, and so we helped them out. Fast forward to 2016, going back to Rio, we're now an official accommodation partner of the Olympics. So there's a real evolution of that partnership with cities.
So that's a good note to end on. I want to thank our panelists for what has been a truly engaging conversation from my perspective. I hope it was from your perspective. It's very clear that there are going to continue to be evolving roles that we really have no idea what the future holds.